Greetings. My dear sisters and brothers and my dear friends, you're all welcome in the evenings with God. And this evening is about how we look at desire. May you enjoy this evening with God. This is Reverend Yeti. In the book of Genesis, we read that God created humankind in the divine image. You can look Genesis up in chapter 1, verse 26. Because we are created in the image of God and have the capacity for God, we are capable of union with God. Today, science is revealing parts of the human brain involved with emotion that may also be involved in the experience of God. If the brain is a complex of neural circuits and God cannot be known without the human brain, then we can say we are wired with God. What these insights suggest on the most basic level is that we are biologically oriented toward God. We are truly God-centered human creatures, whether or not we want to admit it. If this is true, then we should have no trouble recognizing God's voice when God speaks to us. Recognizing God's presence when God appears to us, or recognizing God's embrace when God touches us. But the fact is, we do have trouble recognizing God. However God comes to us, we might say that the tools to know God are all in place. However, they need to be tuned up or fine-tuned or simply acknowledged. God has made it possible to unite with Him, but God does not force us into relationships apart from our consent. God is truly mutual in love, life in God, and therefore is a relationship in love freely chosen. If we desire to grow closer to God, we must come to know God, to learn what God is really like, what the voice of God sounds like, and in many ways God can appear to us in this world. Discernment is getting to know God as person, and personally as friend and lover. As in any relationship, getting to know God is a gradual process, and discernment presupposes obscurity and ignorance about what God is like or really saying to us. Discernment as a process by which we honestly confront ourselves and the spiritual movements within us. The purpose of discernment is to decide which movements are of the Spirit of God and which are not of God. That is, what brings us closer to God and what separates us from the embrace of divine love. Although we desire to seek the will of God and desire lures us toward God, unfamiliarity keeps us at a distance. The Holy One we desire, we also fear because we are unsure and uncertain of what this closeness might bring. Will my life change? Will I change? Will I lose my friends or make new ones? In human relations, friendship is possible because of a blending of desires. If a person wants to be my friend, but I am not attentive to this desire, I may easily overlook his or her efforts to relate to me and thus thwart the desire for friendship. Friendship is possibly only when the desires are mutual. They cannot be coerced. And too often relationships become frustrating because of ambivalent or incompatible desires in one or both parties. In a similar way, God's creative touch in our lives is God's desire for us. But we must respond with desire as well. In the Gospels, Jesus asked the blind man, "What do you want? What do you desire?" The blind man responds, "I want to see." In the same way, God asks us, "What do you want in life?" What is our response? What is our desire? Discernment is recognizing the voice of God whose desires are good. And Jesus says to his disciples, "The sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of a stranger." In Palestine, the shepherds will walk ahead of the sheep, even if the sheep mixed with other sheep at a waterhole. The shepherd could separate his own sheep by just calling them. They knew his voice and they would follow him. To follow the voice of the shepherd is to listen and to trust the one who leads. We might say discernment is choosing the voice we follow. Is it the voice of God or not? How do we know it is the voice of God? What distinguishes it? Is God's voice always sweet and melodious? Can it be angry or sorrowful? Discernment is the art of knowing it is God who is speaking or God who is acting. This art can only be learned by trial and error. It is the process by which we become really wired for God. Just as we learn the voice of a friend through words of love, support, compassion, and thanksgiving, so too do we learn the voice of God. The voice of a friend is comforting, supportive, and nurturing compared to the voice of the enemy, who is hostile, abrasive, threatening, arrogant, or rude. Sometimes we may mistake an enemy for a friend when the words spoken are polite but aggressive, and we are led to follow in the direction of that person until an action occurs and we realize that we are being led to the slaughter. Discernment is obedience to the voice of love that God speaks at every moment of our lives. When we find ourselves in perilous situations, it is then we must listen most attentively to the voice of the Holy One within our hearts. Like knows like. Learning to choose God throughout life's journey becomes a way of life for those who practice it. The one who really lives in God learns to grow old with God. As in any relationship, we really get to know another person, such as a friend, spouse, or community member, after many years of living together. We not only recognize that voice or laughter from another room, but we know exactly what to buy for them and that what they like to eat. It realizes this one Christmas. When I was visiting my family, and I didn't tell my family what I would buy for my grandchildren and for my daughters. But because I know them very well and I know exactly what they want, it was easy for me to choose. And so when it was time to open the presents, they were surprised and looked at me and said, "Oh, wow, you know us very well." I said, "Well, yeah, I know." So discernment is striving for clarity of decisions when choices are presented or there are many options to choose from. To discern the will of God depends on our lived experience of God. How well do we know God? How open are we to be taught by or to be led by God? Are we only knowing an angry God? If that is so, well, I think that it's time to find a place to mirror yourself and to have personal conversations with the beloved. The only way to really know God is through the experience of love, because God, as we give names to God, that God is the unconditional love, for us human beings, we just appoint titles to God. But God is God, and every aspect we give to God will not make him a bigger God, because God will never change like human beings. That is why prayer is fundamental to discernment. We will never be able to choose the way of God if we are not in some way familiar with God's presence, God's voice, and God's touch. Just as any relationship requires a rich soil for the fruit of love to grow, so too discernment, God's will, requires certain conditions. We already spoke of desire and prayer, but humility and charity are also helpful to discernment. Humility is knowing ourselves with our strength and weaknesses and allowing others to be themselves as well. A humble person always bends low, so to speak, not lording it over others, and ready and willing to learn. Without humility, we can easily overlook the will of God at the present moment. Unable to bend low, we are so self-absorbed that we expect everything to come and demand. Charity, too, is helpful to discernment. The charitable person knows well his or her own weakness and sinfulness, and yet is open to the goodness of others. Such a person is slow to judge others, especially if other persons see things differently. The person of charity, therefore, makes room for personal discernment. Recognition that God's will for one person may be different than for another, even if the person is in the same family or community. When the Apostle Peter tried to inquire about Jesus' plans for John, Jesus rebuked him. "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." Discernment, therefore, is keeping our eyes fixed on the Lord and not waiting for others to provide answers to our questions. Even if we seek advice as we struggle to follow Christ, such advice is to help us listen to the breathing of the Spirit in our lives so as to discern God's will. Although humility and charity are essential for choosing God each day, the wise discerner must also be courageous. If one is truly seeking the will of God and open to the many ways God speaks to us, then one must be courageous and ready to risk. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spoke of faith as a paradox of the absurd. Because our eyes to God is a yes, because our yes to God is a yes to the one who is essentially unknown and beyond rational reason, causing us to step outside our comfortable zones into an abyss of uncertainty. If we are really seeking God, then we must be ready for God. We must accept the grace of God's love. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This comes from Isaiah 55, the verses 8 and 9. If we seek the will of God like a guaranteed money-back offer, we will be disappointed. God is mystery, and the best that is offered to us is offered in mystery. So, we must be able to say yes to the hiddenness of God, since hiddenness is the mystery of God. Our yes to God is spoken in darkness when we live in faith that God is with us. But how do we know that the directions of our lives are of God and not some evil spirit? Certitude concerning God's will for us. It is a certitude of faith and not of reason. And it is a practical certitude rather than theoretical. After prayer and reflection, one is sure to act in this way here and now, convinced that such action is the only honest, loving thing to do. It may not be the most reasonable thing to do, but if it brings an inner sense of peace and joy, then it is probably the most honest and attuned to the will of God. Let me give you reflection questions. Do you pray as one who is wired for God? In what ways are you attentive to the movements of the Spirit within you? What do you desire in the present moment for your life? Blessings in this evening with God, and may you find peace within.